The winter of 2023 in Chicago brought with it freezing winds that cut through the desolate streets. The small town of Edgewater, located on the outskirts of the city, was known as a peaceful community where everyone knew each other. But behind the serene facade lay complex relationships, hiding dark secrets. The monotonous houses lining the snow-covered streets, interspersed with flickering lights from the windows, evoked a sense of loneliness and unease. Jack Turner, a 40-year-old construction engineer, had lived here with his daughter, Sarah, for 6 years since his wife passed away. Jack was a quiet man, always trying to keep everything under control, but pain and loneliness had silently invaded his life. Sarah, Jack's young daughter, had now entered adolescence, with all its psychological complexities. She was intelligent and sensitive, but she always felt neglected, even though her father tried hard to care for her. Her mother's death had left a deep wound in Sarah's heart, one that Jack could not fill. Everything started to change when Emma Grace, Sarah's teacher, entered their lives. Emma, a 30-year-old woman full of energy and ambition, was highly respected by everyone, a dedicated teacher loved by both parents and students alike. However, behind that perfect exterior, Emma harbored strong ambitions. She wasn't just seeking career advancement, but also yearning for a different life, one she believed she deserved more than the one she had. Jack and Emma met for the first time during a parent-teacher meeting at Sarah's school. Their eyes met, and it seemed as though an invisible thread pulled them closer. At first, it was just brief conversations about Sarah's studies, but gradually, their meetings became more frequent, and their relationship began to cross professional boundaries. One cold night, when Jack brought Sarah to school for a performance, Emma invited him to stay afterward to discuss Sarah's academic progress. The empty classroom contained only Jack and Emma, and their words slowly shifted from work to personal life. Emma easily sensed Jack's loneliness and skillfully exploited it, as if she knew exactly what he needed. They began a secret relationship, initially just brief, furtive encounters in the shadows. But their emotions soon grew intense and uncontrollable. Sarah, a sensitive and perceptive girl, quickly noticed changes in her father's behavior. Jack often came home late from work, and when he was home, he became distant, easily irritable without any reason. Sarah saw her father spending more time with Emma, not just at school but outside as well, and this made her feel uneasy. Emma, whom Sarah once respected, now seemed strange and dangerous in her eyes. But Sarah didn't know how to express these feelings to her father, fearing it would shatter their already fragile family. The conflict among the three began to arise, as Sarah tried to find ways to stop this relationship. She accidentally overheard a conversation between her father and Emma. A conversation filled with affection and sweetness that she hadn't heard from her father for anyone else since her mother passed away. The feeling of betrayal sank deep into Sarah's heart, and she began to doubt everything around her. Emma, on the other hand, didn't stop at building a relationship with Jack. Her ambition went beyond this secret romance. She wanted more. She wanted Jack to leave everything behind and build a new life with her. Emma had already started drafting her own plan. A plan that could completely change Jack's life, and she wouldn't let anyone, including Sarah, stand in her way. This illicit relationship grew increasingly complicated, as everyone's emotions were pushed to their limits. Jack, though caught in the whirlwind of passion, still loved his daughter, but he found it harder and harder to balance his responsibilities as a father with his personal desires. Sarah, with her intelligence and sharpness, quietly began to observe every action of her father, determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant her world would collapse. As winter deepened, the cold seeped not only outside but into every corner of the Turner family. The secret relationship between Jack and Emma was like a smoldering fire, just waiting for a shock to ignite it. None of the three knew that this winter would bring not only the frost, but also a bloody tragedy they could not escape. Jack Turner, since losing his wife, had tried to be the perfect father for Sarah. But he couldn't hide the deep loneliness in his heart. Sarah was his entire world, but between the two of them, there always existed an invisible distance. Jack didn't fully understand his daughter's emotions as she grew up, while Sarah felt her father no longer paid enough attention to her. The tension grew as Jack slowly drifted into a secret relationship with Emma Grace, Sarah's teacher, and that was when the father-daughter conflict began to erupt. The relationship between Jack and Emma began with seemingly harmless meetings to discuss Sarah's education. Those meetings, held in the small book-filled classroom at school, blurred the initial boundaries. Emma, with her confidence and charm, easily found ways to steer the conversation beyond work. She saw in Jack a weak man, someone who needed comfort, and didn't hesitate to use this to draw him in. Jack, though initially hesitant, was gradually pulled into the whirlwind of emotional conversations with Emma. "Every time I meet you, I feel like we're both searching for something that we can't find in our current lives," Emma said with a meaningful look after a long conversation about Sarah. Jack remained silent, but deep down, he knew that what she said wasn't wrong. At first, they only exchanged messages about Sarah's study schedule, but those messages gradually turned into words of affection, followed by secret meetings at unfamiliar, where no one knew them. Jack knew what he was doing was wrong, but the loneliness overwhelmed his reason, and he couldn't pull back. He was drawn to Emma, not only for her appearance, but also for the attention she gave him, something he had been missing for so long. Jack began to feel pressure from both sides. He knew this relationship would cause irreparable harm, especially to Sarah. Every time he looked at his daughter, with guilt. Sarah was becoming more sensitive to the growing distance between them, and Jack realized this, but he didn't know how to escape the tangled web. Meanwhile, Emma wasn't willing to give up on Jack. She saw in him a man with potential, someone who could offer her a better future. "She never understands us, Jack," Emma whispered in his ear during one of their secret meetings at her apartment. "We have a chance to start over. Don't you want that?" Jack turned away, conflicted. He wanted a new the loneliness, but the price for that was too high. Sarah was everything to him, and he couldn't bear the thought of losing her. The inner turmoil within Jack grew larger as Emma began to push him harder. She wanted him to make a clear decision, but Jack wasn't ready to give up everything. Each time Emma made demands, Jack would either remain silent or evade the conversation, but he knew things couldn't go on like this forever. Meanwhile, Sarah started to sense that something wasn't right between her father and Emma. Being a sensitive and intelligent girl, Sarah couldn't help but notice the small signs, how her father had become more secretive, how he often came home late, and how distracted he seemed whenever she talked to him. She also noticed that her father and Emma had grown unusually close, and it made her uneasy. One evening after school, Sarah accidentally overheard her father and Emma talking on the phone. The suggestive tone in their voices, and the intimacy in her father's words made her suspicious. Her heart raced, and a wave of anxiety washed over her, as she began to piece together the clues in her mind. "I can't wait any longer, Jack." We have to make a decision soon. Emma's voice came through the phone as Sarah stood hidden behind the door. Jack responded vaguely, but it was enough for Sarah to understand that her father was hiding something. From that moment on, Sarah decided she would uncover the truth at any cost. Sarah didn't have to wait long. Secret. One late night, when Jack thought Sarah was asleep, he quietly left the house. But Sarah, with the patience of youth and a strong instinct, decided to follow him. She silently trailed her father, her heart pounding as she watched him enter a small cafe on the other side of town. From a distance, Sarah observed every move her father made. Then, like a knife to her heart, she saw Emma walk into the cafe and sit across from him. They exchanged affectionate glances, and there was no longer any doubt this wasn't a business meeting. Sarah stood frozen, feeling her world collapse in an instant. She stared at her father, the man she once thought was honest and trustworthy, now revealed as a betrayer. Sarah returned home, her heart in turmoil. She couldn't believe that her father, the one who always emphasized honesty and trust, could do this to her. She confronted him as soon as he walked through the door. "I know everything, Dad. I saw it all," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. For a moment, Jack tried to deny it, but the determined look in Sarah's eyes made him realize there was nothing left to hide. She knew everything. He sighed deeply, lowering his head in silence, unable to find the words. The father-daughter relationship, already strained, was now irreparably shattered. Sarah felt as though she had lost her father forever. While Jack tried to fix his mistakes and mend his relationship with Sarah, Emma began to push things further. She demanded that Jack publicly divorce Sarah. She no longer wanted to live in the shadows, and she believed this was the right time for Jack to make his final decision. "We can't go on like this, Jack. You have to choose. Either me, or your family," Emma said, her voice colder and more determined than ever. Jack, standing before this choice, suddenly felt confused. Everything was too complicated. He couldn't abandon Sarah, but he also couldn't deny that he loved Emma. In that moment, Jack realized that Emma wasn't entirely trustworthy. She had forced him into making a drastic choice, and this made him suspicious. Did Emma truly love him, or was she just using him to achieve something for herself? Jack began to rethink everything, and for the first time, he wanted out of the relationship. The atmosphere in Jack Turner's house grew tenser than ever. Sarah, unable to keep this secret any longer, confided in Mrs. Emily, the neighbor who lived next door, and was also a close family friend. Mrs. Emily was someone Sarah had always trusted, like a grandmother she could confide in. After hearing the he couldn't stop worrying about Sarah's mental state, which led her to offer some fateful advice. "You need to tell someone. This secret will destroy your family if it's not addressed." That advice, like a spark to dry wood, quickly spread, and soon the rumor of Jack and Emma's affair circulated throughout the town. Not long after, Jack began to notice a change in the way the neighbors treated him. They looked at him with suspicion, and the usual polite greetings had grown cold. The rumor not only shook his family but also caused his relationship with Emma to become unbearably tense. Emma, realizing that Jack was pulling away from her, angrily confronted him in a heated argument. "You're not standing by me. What do you plan to do now that everything's out in the open? Just let everyone see me as a..." Emma shouted, her eyes blazing with fury. She was no longer the charming woman Jack once knew. Her confidence and ambition had turned into paranoia and fear for the future. She felt betrayed by Jack's refusal to defend their relationship in front of everyone. Jack, cornered and torn apart inside, felt the growing weight of the situation. He knew he couldn't continue living in this mess, but he also didn't know how to resolve everything without hurting Sarah. Emma's words pierced him like a knife, but he couldn't deny that she had a point. "Emma, we can't keep going like this." Jack tried to remain calm, but his voice trembled. "I need to think about Sarah. She's been through enough." But Jack's words only fueled Emma's anger. She lunged at him, pushing him out of her way, but in the scuffle, she suddenly slipped and fell hard against the table. The room fell into a terrifying silence for a few seconds. Jack stood frozen, watching as Emma hit the ground, her head striking the corner of the table, blood spilling from a deep wound on her forehead. For a moment, Jack couldn't believe his eyes. He reached over to Emma, gently shaking her, but there was no response. Emma lay motionless, her eyes blank, devoid of life. Panicking and unsure of what to do, Jack felt his heart tighten. He hadn't meant to hurt Emma, but now she was dead, and he couldn't change that. His mind spun like a whirlwind. If Sarah found out about this, she would be completely destroyed. What could he do to salvage the situation? In a state of utter terror, Jack made an unimaginable decision. He would stage the scene to look like an accident. He lifted Emma's body, placing her neatly on the chair, as if she had fallen from it and accidentally hit her head on the table. Jack wiped away the traces of their argument, erasing any evidence that could implicate him. He thought that if he made everything look perfect, no one would ever know what really happened. As Jack was setting up the scene, Sarah walked into the room. The girl stood frozen in shock, seeing Emma lying on the floor, blood still flowing from her wound. Jack turned to face her, his eyes filled with desperation. He couldn't hide the truth from his daughter. "You can't tell anyone, Sarah," Jack whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. "It was just an accident. We have to protect the family." Still in a state of shock, Sarah could only nod. Her mind seemed frozen, unable to process the reality that her father had been involved in Emma's death. From that moment on, she knew her life would never be the same. But what Jack and Sarah didn't know was that a neighbor had secretly witnessed everything from across the street. Mrs. Emily, the woman Sarah had once trusted and confided in, had accidentally seen the confrontation between Jack and Emma. While she hadn't been able to see the entire event clearly, she had seen enough to understand that Emma's death was no mere accident. She had remained silent until Emma's body was discovered, but the haunting image of what she had seen wouldn't let her rest. After several days of contemplation, Mrs. Emily decided to report the incident to the police, and that decision sparked a turbulent investigation. No one expected that her initial silence would lead to a series of new events. The secrets Jack had been trying to keep hidden were now starting to surface, and his small family was at risk of completely falling apart. The story was far from over. What Jack and Sarah would have to face next would be far more terrifying as the truth began to be investigated and brought to light. Inspector Michael Davis entered the crime scene with a calm and professional demeanor. He was a seasoned investigator, having handled many complex family cases, but this one seemed particularly unusual. Emma Grice's death had been reported as an accident, but there was something in the oppressive atmosphere of the small room that made it hard for him to dismiss the case. Davis crouched down to examine the blood stain on the floor where Emma had lain before she was discovered. Her head had struck the edge of the table, leaving a deep crack in her forehead. The blood had dried, but the signs of a struggle were still evident. He looked around the room, paying attention to even the smallest details, the way the chairs were arranged, the table slightly off its place, and a notebook lying on the floor. Everything seemed to scream that this wasn't just a simple accident. The forensic team had already collected evidence from the scene, and Davis was waiting for the preliminary reports for a more thorough examination. According to the initial report, Jack Turner, who had an intimate relationship with Emma, had called the police after finding her unconscious. Jack's statement was cautious, claiming that Emma had fallen during an argument, but Davis knew better. Injuries as severe as hers couldn't easily be explained by a simple fall. As Davis reviewed the evidence from the scene, he noticed something significant. Jack's fingerprints were found in multiple places. On the chair, the edge of the table, and even on the door. This wasn't unusual, but it conflicted with the way Emma had been found. Jack claimed he hadn't touched her before calling the police, but the evidence at the scene told a different story. Fingerprints near the bloodstains suggested that someone had deliberately altered the crime scene, a detail Davis couldn't overlook. While the forensic reports were still being processed, Davis decided to take a closer look at the relationship between Jack and Emma. He began to review Emma's messages and calls before her death, and what he uncovered was startling. Emma had seemingly planned to start a new life with Jack, with messages indicating that she had prepared everything to demand a divorce from him. But as Davis read through the messages, he noticed a shift in Emma's tone. She became increasingly demanding, even sounding threatening as Jack began to hesitate. Emma's final message to Jack before her death was a warning. "You can't keep running forever. If you don't make a decision, I'll have to do something." Davis knew this was a crucial clue. That statement implied that Emma was pressuring Jack to make a decision, and it could have sparked a much bigger confrontation than Jack had admitted. As the investigation continued, Davis encountered a major obstacle when both Jack and discuss anything beyond their initial statements. Jack consistently insisted that it was just an accident, that Emma had fallen during their argument, and that he hadn't meant to hurt her. Sarah, deeply traumatized, also remained silent, avoiding any further questioning. There were no direct witnesses to the incident other than Jack and Sarah, making Davis's investigation even more challenging. Everything seemed to lead to a dead end. But then, a glimmer of hope appeared when Mrs. Emily, the neighbor who had secretly witnessed part of the altercation through a window, came forward to speak with the police. Though her account wasn't entirely clear, it opened a new direction for the investigation. She described seeing a scuffle between Jack and Emma, followed by Emma falling to the ground. This completely contradicted Jack's initial claim that Emma had fallen on her own. Davis decided to bring Jack in for another interrogation, this time armed with new evidence. In the dimly lit interrogation room, Jack sat tense, the weight of the situation etched across his face. Davis no longer minced words. He directly confronted Jack with Mrs. Emily's testimony, along with the fingerprint evidence showing his involvement at the scene. "Do you really expect me to believe that all of this was just an accident, Jack?" Davis asked, his voice cold but firm. "The evidence doesn't lie. And now we have a witness who saw you pushing Emma before she fell." Jack sat in silence for a few moments, his empty gaze fixed on the table. He knew that everything was closing in on him. There was no escape. Outside the interrogation room, Sarah nervously watched her father through the glass. She knew the truth was slowly unraveling, and that their lives would be changed forever. After a long silence, Jack finally spoke, but it wasn't a confession. "I didn't mean to hurt her. I never intended to kill Emma. It was just an accident." His voice trembled, but there was no genuine remorse. Davis looked at him with a piercing gaze, knowing that Jack was still desperately trying to protect himself at all costs. The investigation wasn't over, but with the forensic evidence and the witness testimony, Davis knew he was closer to uncovering the truth. Only one question remained. Would Jack dare to face the truth, or would he continue to hide it at all costs? The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and Davis would not stop until justice was served. Tensions continued to rise, and with each step forward in the investigation, Jack and Sarah were drawn closer to an inevitable collapse. Emma's death was no longer just an accident. It was the result of betrayal, deceit, and inescapable despair. The courtroom was silent. The only sounds were the rustling of papers and the clacking of the stenographer's keys. Jack Turner sat with his head bowed, his dull eyes fixed on the floor, too drained to face the scrutinizing gazes of the prosecutor, the jury, or even Sarah, his only daughter. The trial had stretched on for weeks, and finally, the jury had reached its verdict: manslaughter. Although there was not enough evidence to prove that Jack had intended to kill Emma, her death could not be written off as a simple accident. "We find the defendant guilty of manslaughter," the judge declared, his voice stern but not entirely harsh. However, given the lack of clear intent to kill and the complexities of the case, the sentence will be reduced. Jack heard the verdict as if it were a distant sound. Nothing more than a faint echo amidst the pain and torment that had filled his soul since the incident. He would serve a short prison sentence, but it would not be a release. The real punishment Jack faced was not the legal one, but the sleepless nights, haunted by memories of Emma and the disappointment in Sarah's eyes. Every moment of his life from now on would be shadowed by the guilt he could never erase. Sarah sat not far from him, but the distance between father and daughter seemed insurmountable. She no longer saw him as the hero she once loved. Sarah's emotional wounds came not only from Emma's death, but from the collapse of her trust in her father. After the trial, she withdrew from everyone, no longer engaging with friends, not even wanting to face the outside world. She lived in painful silence, isolating herself from everyone, slowly becoming detached from society. For Jack, even though he escaped a long prison sentence, he had to live in isolation. The suspicious, distant stares of those around him made him feel like an outcast in the small, once familiar community. Though the trial was over, Emma's death would never truly leave him. Jack was haunted by the memories of that fateful night when he stood frozen, watching Emma fall, and when he tried to cover up the truth. Now, all his efforts seemed meaningless, and he knew he would face Emma's ghost every day for the rest of his life. The story of Jack, Emma, and Sarah wasn't just a family tragedy, it was a reminder of the terrible consequences of betrayal and carelessness in relationships. Emma's death left deep scars, not only on those directly involved, but also on the small community where they lived. Rumors and whispers about the case spread, casting a heavy shadow over the once peaceful town. Whenever Jack Turner's name was mentioned, it was impossible not to remember the tragedy that had unfolded. Sarah and Jack would forever be haunted by the past that, no matter how much they wished to forget, they never could. For Sarah, the image of a perfect father was shattered. And for Jack, he would live out the rest of his days, tormented by relentless guilt. a punishment far more severe than any prison sentence.